Welcome back to my new mini-series, my friends. If you've seen part 1 already, you know exactly what we're doing today. If you haven't, make sure you go check it out so that you're all caught up. But basically, we are checking out the combat style of each of the 8 new weapon types. And I'm comparing them to the most similar base game weapon types, so that you'll be fully prepared when going into the DLC, and you'll know that if this is your favourite weapon from the base game, then this will probably be the DLC weapon that you want to focus on first, as it's the most similar in style and moveset. The 4 weapon types we covered in the previous video, being hand-to-hand, throwing blade, backhand blade, and great katana, all have pretty good comparisons, so it was really easy to give you suggestions and alternatives to help set you up for the DLC. However, this video will play out a little differently, as the 4 weapons we have remaining today, being the Thrusting Shield, Beast Claw, Light Greatsword, and Perfume Bottle, are all so different and unique to anything that we've used before, that I'm going to have to approach these builds from a different angle and maybe do some theory crafting. With that being said, let's start off by talking about the Beast Claw. The Beast Claw, I can almost guarantee that at least initially this will be nobody's favourite weapon, just because it seems to have a very steep learning curve and its moveset is so erratic. Then add to this the fact that it is unlike any weapon we have in the base game. Yes, it is technically another claw-type weapon, it's even got the word claw in the name, but it is nothing like the claws from the base game. The one similarity is that when you are wielding one Beast Claw, if you switch to two-handed mode, you will start to dual wield them. However, this really is where the similarities end, because you then gain the most unwieldy and insane moveset I've ever seen in a FromSoftware game. You are jumping around, you're doing aerial slam attacks, you're diving from left to right, and I can imagine due to all of this, this weapon is going to be chaotic in PvP. And also due to this fact, it was exceptionally hard for me to recommend any comparable build to run from the base game if you'd like to switch up to the Beast Claws being the main focus of your build going into the early parts of the DLC. In fact, this moveset is so unique that it's actually far easier for me to compare the moveset to certain weapon arts rather than actual weapons. For instance, if you like using the weapon art of the Bloodhound's Fang or the Ash of War Raptors of the Mists, they're about the only things that are similar-ish to the Beast Claw's base moveset. So if you enjoy using things like this and other Ashes of War like Bloodhound Step and Quick Step, then I think this will eventually be your absolute favourite weapon once you've had the time and the practice with it. Given all of this information, let's now look at a really great movement-oriented build that I'd recommend you dive into the DLC with if you're planning on transitioning to the Beast Claws. This build was a lot of fun to put together, and it will actually utilize one of the new talismans from the DLC. I am talking about the talisman you get from the Dancing Lion, which increases the potency of storms. And the weapon we'll be using to get the most out of this, whilst trying to stay within the theme of the Beast Claw, is the Veteran's Prosthesis, specifically its weapon art, Storm Kick. This is just an insanely fun weapon to use, and it does have a dual damage type of physical lightning, and we absolutely love dual damage types in our builds because it does mean being able to exploit more enemy weaknesses. As the Veteran's Prosthesis has a C scaling in strength and a D scaling in dex, this means it's slightly more beneficial for you to pump your strength stat, however it will gain a decent increase from dexterity as well. Therefore, I advise a somewhat quality hybrid build, however focus primarily on getting your strength stat up first. And of course, this will be helped greatly by the likes of Godric's Great Rune, Radagon's Source Seal, and the Star Scourge Heirloom. If you have all of these active at once, you will get plus 15 extra points in strength. On top of these, the Erdtree's Favor Plus 2 is just an incredible talisman all around, and I recommend it for basically every single one of my builds. And for any build where we are going to be heavy on our weapon art usage, the Shard of Alexander is just absolutely incredible. Though eventually, when you do get that new talisman, I would recommend swapping out probably Radagon's Source Seal, because enemies in the DLC pack a punch, and the increased damage that you take from this talisman can be quite detrimental. As for the weapon itself, it is very, very light, and the only other thing I would advise you use is the Frenzied Flame Seal, so you can use your faith buffs. So aside from this, it leaves you with a hell of a lot of equip load to work with. Therefore, I am wearing the full Omen set because it's one of the tankiest armor sets in the game, and because I'm going to be getting very up close and personal with my enemies, I want to be as tanky as possible. And on that point, because of that, another recommendation potentially that I would advise for your talisman is the Dragon Crest Great Shield, just because, as it says, it's going to enormously boost your physical damage negation. Aside from this, just apply your usual buffs. Drink your Physic, which I advise has the Strength Knot tier and the Lightning Shrouding tier to buff both your regular attacks and your Storm Kick. And apart from that, now you're just going to spam Storm Kick over and over again and melt almost everything in the game. This build really is as simple as that and should set you up absolutely phenomenally for switching to the Beast Claws. Next up, let's have a look at what your build should look like if you're building towards the Thrusting Shield. I actually had way more fun with this one than I thought I would, and it surprised me how good it was. Initially, I thought the Thrusting Shield would be the hardest weapon to make a similar build for, to help you transition into the DLC if this is the weapon that you want to focus on. However, I have since proven myself wrong, and I've come up with one of the most fun builds ever. The Thrusting Shield, as you will probably know by now, is all about the perfect blend between offense and defense, keeping yourself protected whilst dishing out loads of damage. This is something that's quite hard to replicate, and initially I didn't think any build in the base game would allow me to do this. However, two weapons eventually came to mind, of which I am very happy with the results. This build is entirely based around madness, with both weapons causing madness buildup. We are of course talking about Vike's War Spear and the Fingerprint Stone Shield. This is one of the more complex builds I'll be covering in this two-part miniseries, so please pay attention and bear with me. The first thing you're going to want to do is purchase the No Skill Ash of War from Bernal, and then apply that to your Fingerprint Stone Shield. This will allow you to use the Frenzy Flame Thrust of Vike's War Spear without ever needing to unequip your shield, meaning you are fully protected at all times. Of course, alongside this, you'll be using the Frenzied Flame Seal and many of the Frenzied Flame incantations. Next, let's talk about the armor. Using anything you can to increase your max equip load, you now want to equip the heaviest armor you possibly can that will increase your focus. This is because the more focus resistance you have, the more madness buildup you can handle before the debuff will proc. Therefore, I opted for primarily the Royal Knight set with Blythe's armor, and actually it looks pretty damn cool. And the accompanying talismans that I have used are the Greatjar's Arsenal, Radagon's Source Seal, and the Erdtree's Favor +2, all of which are going to increase both my endurance and therefore my max equip load. And finally, just so I have as much focus as possible, the Clarifying Horn Charm +1. You may be thinking, as this build is very focused around your shield, why haven't I recommended the Great Shield Talisman? Well, this is such a late game build, and all the Great Shield Talisman does is slightly reduce the amount of stamina used up when you successfully block an enemy's attack. And honestly, your stamina bar is pretty damn beefy at this point of the game, and the Great Shield Talisman is quite negligible, so the other talismans that I've recommended are going to be far more efficient. There are many viable physic options for this build because it's so versatile and varied. For instance, you could use the Flame Shrouding cracked here to increase the fire damage dealt by both your weapon and your spells. Also, you could use the Dex Knot or Faith Knot tiers to increase the attack power of your physical and fire damage. Or alternatively, because this is supposed to be a really long-lasting, tanky build, you could use the likes of the Opaline Hard tier or Bubble tier to boost your damage negation even further. Another huge thing I should mention about the DLC as we're talking about physic tiers is the new Deflecting Hard tier that you get when you beat the Furnace Golem. As you'll know if you've watched my preview video, the Furnace Golem wandering around the center of the first area drops the new Deflecting Hard tier when defeated. And when you drink this, it means that your next Spontaneous Guard will increase your defensive stats, including your poise and your damage reduction. And if you didn't know, Spontaneous Guard just means bringing up your block at the last second. So similar to a parry timing, but using the block button. Aside from this, if we now take a look at the spells, of course 2 great options are Golden Bough and Flame Grant Me Strength. Please note that the Howl of Shabriri, if you choose to use this, would override Flame Grant Me Strength. Howl of Shabriri is stronger, giving you a 20% increase to your damage, but it will also make you take 30% increased damage. So the safer option is Flame Grant Me Strength, and as both of these are body buffs, you can only use one at a time, so choose wisely based on how confident you are with your skills. Next up, Flame Cleanse Me is always a fantastic thing to have handy, just in case you get poisoned or rotted, but primarily Unendurable Frenzy and Frenzied Burst are both going to be absolutely devastating spells for this build. Frenzied Burst allowing you to do thousands of damage from a bloody mile away from your enemies, and Unendurable Frenzy allowing you to just melt targets in a matter of seconds. Though this one is more risky because you tend to have to be a lot closer to your target. And as for your stats, I'd say a good hybrid between Dex and Faith, maybe 60 Dex and 40 Faith, and then the usual for your Vigor and Mind, whilst pumping Endurance as high as you can so you can make yourself really tanky, while still being able to wield the Fingerprint Stone Shield. On top of utilizing all of this information, don't forget about guard counters. This is the absolute most powerful thing you can do with this build, as the Fingerprint Stone Shield will almost completely negate damage from every single source. It is hands down the most powerful shield in the game against every single damage type. It's so incredibly overpowered if you have the equip load to use it. For this reason, you can spend 99% of every fight with your shield up, and you can just poke from behind your shield using Vike's Spear. That's the fantastic thing about pairing this shield with a great spear weapon, is the fact that it has a special moveset that allows you to poke enemies from behind your shield. Add to that, as I've already said, the fact that you can use guard counters. This means pressing the heavy attack button just after an enemy's attack has bounced off your shield, allowing you to deal devastating amounts of damage in the form of a counter attack. All of these tools, abilities, and spells combined make for one of the most powerful builds I've ever created. I'm not sure if anyone else has ever done something similar to this. They probably have, because now that I've created it, it seems pretty obvious. But honestly, I had such joy thinking this up. And even if you're not planning on using thrusting shields as your main weapon of choice for the DLC, this could very well be the build for you, just to help you survive the early levels, because it's so insanely powerful. And on that note, let's finally move on to the most anticipated new weapon type for the DLC, based on multiple votes and polls, the Light Greatsword. I initially thought that the Light Greatsword would be the easiest weapon of all 8 new weapon types in the DLC to create a similar build for. But because it feels such a perfect niche, nothing is even remotely similar to it. Having used the Milady and knowing the moveset quite well now, along with its incredibly fun Ash of War wing stance, no weapon in the base game even comes close to the speed, the moveset, or even just how damn fun it is to use. Therefore, I've got 2 quite different builds for you today that try to do a decent job of setting you up for your transition into the Light Greatsword, the most anticipated weapon type of Shadow of the Erdtree. As I covered in my preview video, it's faster than the Greatsword and more powerful than the Straight Sword. It's the perfect in-between. And due to these facts, it's a weapon I am so insanely excited about using again. Therefore, I have tried to replicate this by using high damage, fast swords with interesting Ashes of War. And the first one that made perfect sense to me is, of course, the Sword of Night and Flame. This is an above average DPS straight sword with one of the best Ashes of War in the game. Both the mini Comet Azure from the Sword of Night stance and the awesome sweeping fire arc from the Sword of Flame stance make this such an incredibly versatile weapon. Combine that with the fact that it inherently has 3 different damage types, makes this an absolute force to be reckoned with against most enemies in the game. As you can see, I have paired this with the Beast Champion armor set and the Brass Shield to give me loads of survivability whilst keeping my equip load quite low. There's not much more I need to say about this build, it is pretty bog standard. We've got the tried and true favourites of Golden Vow and Flame Grant Me Strength, along with some of the most solid talismans in the game. Erdtree's Favour +2 for the survivability and increased equip load. I'm running Marika's Source Seal just because my stats are so random and varied at the moment. But honestly, if I was you, I would specialise into either sorceries or incantations and run something like the Graven Mass Talisman or the Phlox Canvas Talisman. And then any damage negation talisman of your choice, I always recommend the Dragon Crest Great Shield because most enemies do physical damage. And finally, of course, the Shard of Alexander so that your Sword of Night and Flame weapon art does maximum damage. Combine this with your favourite spells and you'll be good to go. Very simple build and super effective. Now for the more niche and a bit more interesting build. This one can do a lot more damage, but it is also higher risk, and this revolves around the Ant Spur Rapier. Specifically, we are going to apply Seppuku with the Poison Affinity. This will mean that inherently, along with Scarlet Rot buildup, it will also cause poison buildup, and then if you use Seppuku, it will cause blood loss buildup as well. So 3 status effects at once. As you'll see, I am rocking the Witch's Glintstone crown, although I would advise you wear the Mask of Confidence. This will bump up your arcane just a little bit more, so you can apply your status effects more often without any downsides. And as for your talismans, if you want to go very greedy with your damage to capitalize on all these status effects, my recommendations are the Rotten Winged Sword Insignia because of how frequently you'll be attacking, and then the Kindred of Rot's Exaltation and the Lord of Blood's Exaltation, both of which will increase your attack power when you trigger Poison or Rot and also when you trigger Bleed. Then I have got Marika's Source Seal, just because my stats are a bit of a mess, but if you min-max your stats better than me and drop loads of stats out of Faith and completely drop Int so that you can buff your Dexterity and Arcane, then you can replace Marika's Source Seal with some kind of defensive talisman. As always, you know exactly the one I would recommend. This build is not going to do as much DPS as the Sword of Night and Flame, but because of all the status effects, you will be dealing crazy amounts of chip damage, leaving you more time to run away from the enemies and be defensive. And then if you want to add some freezing pots into the mix, you can have 4 status effects applied to your enemies at once, drastically increasing your damage output above that of most other builds in the game. Both of the builds I've showed you that compare kind of somewhat to the Light Greatsword are ridiculously fun while being pretty tanky, and allowing you to output loads and loads of damage should serve you very well in the DLC. And now for the final weapon in the series, we're going to take a look at the Perfume Bottle. You probably already know what I'm going to say about the Perfume Bottle. It's so unique and different to basically anything else that already exists that it was very hard to come up with any good comparisons from the base game, until I remembered about a particular big sweeping Ash of War that already exists on 2 weapons in the game. If we take a look at the Perfume Bottle side by side with the weapon art Nebula, you can definitely see some similarities here. Yes, it is a bit slower and the base moveset of the weapons doesn't really match up, but I feel like Nebula is about the closest representation we currently have in the base game to the Perfume Bottle. And if you didn't know, Nebula comes as default on both the Wing of Astel and Bastard Stars. And on top of this, if you've been watching my channel for a while, you'll already know that I have put the Wing of Astel in my list of top 10 weapons in the entire game. So, using this information, let's create an entire build around this absolute powerhouse of a weapon to help us tackle the early parts of the DLC and get to the point of collecting our first Perfume Bottle. And fun fact, you can actually acquire your first Perfume Bottle very early on without really even needing to fight a single enemy. From the first site of Grace, you just run northeast straight towards Castle Ensis. Once you're over the bridge, hang a right and head southeast along another road, and at the end you will find Tiolier, who I spoke about in my preview video, and he will sell you the Poison Perfume Bottle. Honestly, the fact that I can still remember the route to this NPC when I've literally done it once, weeks ago, during a very intense period of my life, just baffles me. My wife says I've got this weird brain and I just absorb everything, which really does serve me very well, to be fair, considering my job is literally creating guides for games like Elden Ring. Anyway, sorry for a little bit of a tangent into my life there. Let's get back to the build for the Wing of Astel. The first thing to know is this is a Dex-Int hybrid weapon, and although it does scale better with Int, so arguably you want your Intelligence as the much higher stat, there is a real benefit to having your Dexterity very high as well. So whilst I'm already on the topic, let me touch on that briefly. If you didn't know, increasing your Dexterity will give you lots of hidden modifiers that people tend to forget about, and one of these is the ability to quicken your spellcasting. The maximum casting speed is at 70 dexterity, and there is also a talisman in the game that will give you a virtual 30 dexterity, which will increase your casting speed, and that is the Radagon icon. So the Radagon icon doesn't actually give you 30 dexterity, but what it does do is it adds that dexterity modifier specifically to the casting time of your spells. So if you have 40 dex plus the Radagon icon, you will then hit the maximum casting speed of 70 dexterity. However, we have far better talismans for this build, so I advise trying to get your dexterity up to around 60 by yourself without the use of this icon, and also trying to get your int to around the same number so that you can deal maximum damage with both your weapon art, and your spells. Alongside this, grab your seal and staff of choice so you can cast your faith buffs and then switch to your staff to cast your main spells. On top of this, as you see, I'm rocking the Twin Sage Glintstone Crown for an extra +6 in intelligence. However, it does lower both your maximum HP and stamina. So if you're not starving for int as much as I am, I strongly recommend the Imp Head Cat, which will only give you +2 in intelligence, but it won't give you any negative modifiers, but it's actually also got really good damage negation and resistances for its weight. It is just a solid helm, and it will also buff your int at the same time. Aside from this, just wear the tankiest armor set you can afford. And then as for the talismans, the two that are an absolute must are the Graven Mass Talisman to greatly increase the power of your sorceries, and the Shard of Alexander to do the same thing for Nebula on your Wing of Astel. Apart from this, I always rock the Erdtree's Favor +2 because it's my favourite talisman in the game, and if you aren't needing to bump your stats up with the likes of Marika's Source Seal, I strongly recommend switching this one out for your favourite damage negation talisman of choice. Before I move on to what tiers should be in your Wondrous Physic along with your spells and actual general combat usage, I wanted to give you a little sneak preview into my next upcoming video. I've been giving you all of these half-baked build guides for you to run with and make your own based on the DLC weapons, but I really wanted to give you a fully fleshed out, complete build guide from the ground up of exactly what I will be running going into the DLC. As you can probably tell from the last few videos, I give these things a hell of a lot of thought, so I'm going to try to make this as perfect as possible. So if you want a really tight, really fleshed out build, check out my next video and see what I personally am running to tackle the DLC. And I'll also give you a few general hints and tips as well of how to tackle some of the new enemies and areas. Now, as I say, back to this build, for the Physic, I strongly recommend the Intelligence Knot tier and the Magic Shrouding tier, as almost all of your damage will come from Intelligence and Magic attacks, so boosting these things is an absolute must. And finally, for the spells, we have our 3 usual tried and tested faith buffs, along with whichever sorceries you most prefer. As you can see, my usual setup is Comet, Stars of Ruin and Magic Glintblade, along with Loretta's Mastery and Carian Phalanx. This gives me such a wide range of spells for all situations and ranges then, so I will basically start every fight by casting Carian Phalanx, and then charging up a Loretta's Mastery from as far away as possible, and then start spamming Comets while the enemy is coming towards me. And this allows me to deal upwards of 10,000 damage before the enemy has even got to me, which will take down even the biggest enemies in the game before they have a chance to even react. And finally, in case you've missed it on my previous videos, these awesome glowing messages on the ground with the strikeout through them, this is actually someone who is in the Dom's Roundtable group. they have gone into the multiplayer menu in-game and they have set Knights as one of their 5 group passwords. This means they are now part of the Knights of Dom's Roundtable, and this will allow you to engage in jolly cooperation and be helped by other members of this community. And if you want to take that one step further, you can join the Discord as well, where we are always engaging in various discussions such as builds, PvP, and just general chat. So if that sounds good to you, enter the password in-game, join the Discord, and I'll speak to you soon. And with that, my friends, all that's left for me to say is thank you so much for watching. I hope you have an amazing day, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.